families would concentrate themselves inside these various houses. And then, on the basis of there being a sort of sufficient concentration of population in Palestinian houses, Israel would launch missile attacks against those specific houses. Obviously, this is consistent with the view of the whole Goldstone Commission, which talks about deliberate attacks against civilians. But it's even more evil because it suggests that we just didn't waste our munitions on houses that had a few civilians in them, but look for the houses which had large concentrations of civilians. There's one technical flaw in his analysis. Israel does not have unmanned aerial vehicles with this capability. So where does he get this assertion? How does he reach such a conclusion? Moreover, morally, it's completely inconsistent with the kind of warfare that Israel tried to wage. As I said before, Israel was trying to separate the military capabilities of Hamas from the civilian population through the multiple warning systems. But that doesn't affect his analysis. He takes the most dire, serious, and vicious interpretation of Israeli intentions possible. Another very important element of how Desmond Travers operates is also in how he presents data. For example, he tries to state that Israel was not justified in going into Gaza with Operation Cast Lead. And when he tries to make this assertion, he says, well, there were only 2 rocket attacks in the month prior to the war. Remember when the war begins, December 27th, 2008. Go back a month, November 27th, 2008. Were there only 2 rockets historically fired against Israel in that time period? Well, I can tell you that if I just take 3 days in December, December 16th, 17th, and 18th, prior to the war, we have 32 Hamas rockets fired at Israel. So how does he get 2 rockets fired? His use of data and information is seriously flawed and completely inconsistent with anybody who followed what was going on in the outbreak of the war. By the way, he also says that Hamas wanted to continue the Tahadiyah, the lull agreement that existed. Well, we know for certain from multiple sources that Hamas unilaterally broke the Tahadiyah, from Khalid Mashal in Damascus, and from the spokesman for the Izzadin al-Qassam units. So there's a fundamental problem with how Travers, who is supposed to be a military man, deals with historical data and military data that, in connection with the war. I want to focus last about an issue that keeps coming up in Travers' analysis, and that is it really deals with the professionalism of his investigations. One of the big controversies that is generated by the Goldstone report is the question of whether mosques in the Gaza Strip were militarized. Now, one of the unfortunate developments that has occurred across the Middle East is exactly this problem, the militarization of mosques. In Fallujah, in 2004, during the Iraq War, 60 mosques were identified by the U.S. Army as either containing insurgents or their weaponry. 60 mosques. Now, Israel knew about military materiel in various Palestinian mosques in the Gaza Strip. And in fact, we have documented that military presence in previous appearances that I've made and certainly other Israelis have made. Let me, before I turn to this, make the point that Travers states in an interview he gave with Harper's Magazine on October 29, 2009. He makes a sweeping generalization. He says, we found no evidence that mosques were used to store munitions. Now, how does he deal with those in Israel who say, yes, munitions were stored in those mosques? Then he says in response, well, those charges reflect Western perceptions in some quarters that Islam is a violent religion. In other words, his analysis, military analysis, of whether mosques were used or not isn't based on any kind of hard evidence, isn't based on investigating the mosques themselves, but rather on his view that anybody who would even think that a mosque had been militarized simply has some kind of a prejudice against Islam as a religion. The fact of the matter is, this statement that mosques were not used to store munitions is completely wrong. And I'll just show you a couple of very small examples. If we could move the cursor first to the upper left-hand case and click there. This is the Al-Zaytun Mosque with rockets inside, with an 05 anti-aircraft gun. And this is just one case of one mosque. Now, of course, he doesn't even accept that this is possible. How does he deal with this very clear pictures of the Zaytun Mosque? Well, what he says in his last interview, Travers asserts that Israel made up these pictures. They're false. They're fake. Israel produced fake evidence. But remember his principle, that in the Islamic world, mosques are not used for military purposes. And anyone who says it is against Islam. I just want to show you in the lower right-hand corner a case. We'll click that. This is the Ibn Taymiyyah Mosque in Rafiq, which had been taken over by an Al-Qaeda affiliate who was fighting Hamas. In other words, his fundamental notion that it's impossible that mosques can be used for military purposes is also contradicted by what happened on August 14th, 2009, when there was a clash between Hamas and an Al-Qaeda affiliate in the city of Rafiq. Of course, we would offer no explanation of how this is possible. The other two cases I won't go into, they just show that, in fact, mosques had been used to store munitions, either through secondary explosives in the upper right-hand corner, or mosques were used as an area from which rockets were launched. Maybe you could show this picture in the lower left-hand corner. And there you see the minaret of the mosque from where the rocket was launched, Qassam rocket at Israel. In other words, we have overwhelming evidence of this. Now, the final point is his notion that mosques weren't used to store munitions was actually contradicted by a former British officer by the name of Tim Collins, who went to the Gaza Strip for the BBC. And we've taken a segment out of his appearance on Newsnight, which appeared on the 20th of January 2010. And what is interesting here is that Collins inspects a mosque that Israel attacked. And he goes down into the basement of the mosque to understand what was the source of the damage, because there was more damage there than just the Israeli strike. And what he finds is that there were secondary explosives that were caused by the fact that munitions were stored in the basement of the mosque. In other words, Tim Collins, on the site inspection,